All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Ducker Frontier's webinar, Navigating COVID-19 and Post-Pandemic Scenarios for Peru. My name is Madison Olson, and I'm a Client Relationship Manager for Latin America at Ducker Frontier. Before we get started, I realize that some of you may be new to Ducker Frontier, so I thought I would just take 2 minutes to provide you all with a very quick overview of our firm and how we typically work with executives at major multinationals. So at a glance, Ducker Frontier is a market intelligence and consulting firm. We provide tailored solutions to drive growth for clients across the B2B, healthcare, consumer, and technology sectors. Our dedicated teams serve as advisors to clients, delivering the market and industry knowledge they need to succeed at all points of the business cycle. Our ongoing research and insights, custom solutions, and transaction support services provide clients with timely, actionable insights to adapt and win in evolving markets. Our company is headquartered in Washington, D.C., with offices in Troy, Michigan, New York, London, Paris, Berlin, Singapore, Shanghai, and Bangalore. For more information, please visit www.duckerfrontier.com. So with that very brief overview, it is now my pleasure to introduce you all to our presenter today, Alex Schober. Alex is our Senior Analyst for Latin America Research and covers Argentina, Chile, Peru, and Uruguay at Ducker Frontier.
Thank you, Madison, and good morning to everyone.
All right, now let's get started. To touch on the structure of today's event, our teleconference will consist of a 45-minute moderated discussion, followed by several minutes of Q&A. At any time, again, if you have any questions or points of clarification regarding any of the topics that we covered today, please send them directly to Ducker Frontier Webinars using the chat function. We will do our best to try to answer all of these questions during the Q&A period at the end of the session. All right, Alex, well, thank you so much for your time today. Please take it away.
Thank you again, and again, good morning to everyone. My name is Alex Schober, and I cover the Southern Cone markets here at Ducker Frontier. Let me first and foremost say that I hope everyone on the line is safe and that your family members are doing well, and if not, our heart goes out to you either way. So let me get started by quickly explaining the polling system, which might be something new to y'all if you're not used to either our live webinars or live presentations or any of the webinars that we have done up until this point. But what we like to do at this company is try to have an idea of where our clients are experiencing during some of these tough times and have a little bit of an idea of, what are some of the strategies that they're doing. So really what I would like you to do is type pollev.com/dfrontier560 on your phone to be able to poll during this time. And it would be really great at the beginning, it'll prompt you to type your name. If you could at least type the industry that you belong to, whether it be B2C, industrials, IT, any other industry, or if you're just casually listening, no company. And this is gonna be really great for us to be able to separate these answers by industry if possible and have a better idea of how you compare vis-a-vis your peers. So let's use this and put this into action. The first thing that I will do is ask a live question for everyone on the line. And this is a pretty straightforward one, but really I just wanted to know by how much you estimate COVID-19 will impact your revenues in Peru this year. And all you'll need to do is select one question and we'll be able to go from there. So it looks like we're slowly getting some answers in. With regards to what Madison was saying earlier, if you do have any questions at any point during the presentation, we'll do our best to address them at the end. And you can send them directly via chat function to Ducker Frontier's webinars, and we'll be able to answer them towards the end of the presentation.
So it looks like we're still getting a few more results coming in. But Alex, please tell us, how do you think this compares to what you've seen for other countries or even what you've heard from our clients so far?
Well, I'm surprised to see that 25% are saying that there's no top impact on top line revenue expected. Uh, I think the general trend so far has been anywhere between 11 and 20%. I think that this number has been getting progressively more negative as we've had more of these webinars and more time has passed since the beginning of the pandemic, and the economic realities have started to become more acute. But you can see that this is a little bit more divergent between not having too much impact versus having quite a bit of impact. So I'm going to go ahead and move on and start the presentation in full. Thank you for all who answered the question here. And really, before I get started by talking about what I will be presenting in more detail, I just want to give everyone kind of a quick summary of what to expect in this presentation, some of the key takeaways. And this is really a great page to use to pass along to any of your colleagues who may not have been able to attend today's presentation. So the first thing is that Peru's record of economic growth is going to be derailed by COVID-19. As many of you know, Peru has had nearly 2 decades of very strong economic performance, being one of the strongest and fastest growing markets in the entire region, especially among the major markets. And the extremely stringent social distancing measures that President Vizcarra and the government have enacted up until this point will certainly lead to the country's first recession since 1998, and probably one of the worst recessions in the country's history. The second thing is that early reaction hasn't been enough. And for those of you who read the scripting in full for the presentation when you signed up, you'll notice that this is one of the questions that I strive to answer during this presentation is, why hasn't this early reaction been enough? The main reasons why we think this has really been the case is because of high levels of informality and strained healthcare infrastructure. But I will say that it probably is also a result of the true numbers being a little bit more accurate because of high testing capabilities that Peru has. Thirdly, Peru has enacted a pretty robust fiscal stimulus up until this point, or total economic stimulus if you want to include monetary policy as well. It's about 12% of GDP, which is one of the largest in the region besides maybe Brazil. There's probably more room for even more stimulus, but this is not going to be enough to help mitigate the economic storm this year, although it will help have a little bit more of a positive impact in 2021. Fourth, the COVID-19 and economic fallout will determine political scenarios post-pandemic. It's easy for us to forget that Peru has very important elections next year. They had a snap legislative elections in January, which means that Congress really only has a year to get stuff done. So there's really no time to lose. And the way that the government deals with the COVID-19 economic fallout will certainly have an impact on how those political scenarios pan out. And then finally, we should expect around 2 to 3 years to return to sustainable growth in Peru. And I'll go through what I mean by that in terms of levels towards the end of the presentation. But in the meantime, companies will be able to find opportunities. Just because we're in probably the worst of the economic storm right now in Peru, it doesn't mean that there are not opportunities to be found in the short term. And this will certainly become a more attractive market as more time passes along, as other countries in Latin America will certainly experience. So the first thing that I want to do is give an idea to all of you who have not seen it, how we are analyzing COVID-19 from an economic lens. Clearly, this is something that's been on everyone's minds and is the headline of every newspaper. We're taking a slightly different approach here and are trying to analyze this by 4 key variables. And the 4 key variables that you'll see are things that we'll get to go into in detail through the next few pages. The first one being the reoccurrence, length, and stringency of social distancing measures. Secondly is the government stimulus during and after these social distancing measures. The third is the timing of the treatment and vaccine. And I personally think this is probably the most important thing to get consumer and business confidence back to the same levels that they're at before the pandemic. And lastly, it's very certain that we will have political and social ramifications from COVID-19, whether it be through social unrest or through more political uncertainty going into the next year. Either way, it's certainly going to be a factor for the medium to long term. So first thing is that dancing with COVID-19 has really become our base case in most countries. One thing that we should mention here is that we've been inspiring our analysis so far on this piece by Tomás Puello, which is called Coronavirus, the Hammer and the Dance, which is basically an analysis of how governments can enact social distancing measures to deal with the initial outbreak, as well as reopening the economy and dealing with secondary outbreaks. It's clear that no country in Latin America is in the dance phase yet. I would say every country in Latin America is on the hammer phase with varying levels of success. But eventually we're going to get to the point like how we've seen in Western Europe and Asia up until this point, even you could say in China with their most recent outbreak, that we are going to have not the most smooth reopening process, and there probably will be slight secondary clusters of the virus. So in this case, we are expecting governments to be able to dance the dance, and the hammer was an important phase in order to learn how to deal with the capabilities of healthcare infrastructure, testing, tracing, etc. But it's clear that not every government is going to have the exact same level of success dancing the dance. We do expect there to be some that are going to be more effective, which is something that we call the samba, or a faster dance in Latin America. And then there's the bachata, which is a less effective dance, and in this case slower and a little bit bumpier, and may result in, let's just say, a higher chance of a bigger lockdown than we would expect in the bachata phase. So this is really the key characteristics and to differentiate key good dancing skills from not so great ones. I'm not going to go through all the text here just because it's a lot to read, but these are the things that mattered for the hammer phase as well. But some of them are going to become even more important to get right in this next phase. The first thing is early reaction. Obviously, this is something that Peru did really well, and it's key for Latin America to reopen at the right pace. So if there is secondary outbreaks, reacting early and dancing with the right tempo is going to be crucial. So either initiating early border controls or enacting the proper social distancing measures based on geography or what have you is incredibly important. Two, good information. The more info that we have about who has the virus, who might have the virus, who has had the virus, the more targeted social distancing can be. That means less economic damage. And the opposite would probably force countries to return to larger scale lockdowns, as I was mentioning a minute ago, which would be a little bit more of a characteristic of the bachata slow dance measure. Third is healthcare infrastructure. I think this is probably the most important part of the hammer phase, but it's going to be very important to see the results of this during the dancing phase. In other words, the hammer in these large scale lockdowns was an opportunity for governments to build up the capacity to reduce contagion, to reduce mortality. This means increasing the number of hospital beds, including ICU, trying to buy ventilators, PPE for healthcare workers, and for the general population as well. And the last thing is also ramping up your testing and tracing capabilities I mentioned in the last point. And then finally, endorsement from local authorities. Basically, the more aligned that people are, the more that citizens are going to buy into that, and they're going to actually do the things that the government say that they want to do. So with regards to everything that I've said up until this point, Peru undeniably entered the hammer phase on March 15th when it enacted a full lockdown, which was one of the first countries in Latin America to do so. And interestingly enough, it did this with only less than 100 known cases of the virus in less than 2 weeks after the first case even appeared. This seemed to be a really bold and quick response of Martín Vizcarra, the president of Peru, and it has resulted in extensive literature on the subject of what went wrong. Because if you look at these numbers, which are total deaths per 1 million people, you'll see that Peru's number is high and that the slope of the line is accelerating. Over the next few slides, I'm going to try to attempt to hash out why we believe Peru's policy response hasn't worked out as planned. Lastly, and this is a relatively subjective analysis, but we divided this graph into likely bachata and likely samba dancers. At least based on the reality of the situation on the ground, we believe it's more likely than not that Peru will be slightly less effective in reopening and dealing with secondary outbreaks than, say, Uruguay, Costa Rica, and even Colombia from larger scale economies. You can see on this slide that Peru shuttered the entire country at the aim of containing the coronavirus. Basically, this chart has been constantly updated over the course of the coronavirus, measuring what Peru and other countries were doing during the peak of the pandemic, say back in April versus now. And you can see that Peru has slightly started to slowly open back up, which I'll talk about in a minute. But Peru was also one of the only countries to fully enact this lockdown. Colombia and Argentina were the two other major economies that did that. Brazil has not resulted to a complete nationwide lockdown, and Chile has not resulted to a full nationwide lockdown either. But that being said, that clearly has not had a clear correlation with why the amount of cases in Peru has been higher than, say, Colombia and Argentina. So one possible explanation of why Peru has been hit harder is due to testing gaps vis-a-vis other Latin American countries. In other words, Peru's been testing a lot. As you can see by this page, Chile is really the only country that's been testing nearly as much as Peru, and it's only a little bit more than Peru for that matter, and significantly more than Mexico, Argentina, and Brazil. So one metaphor that I read recently that I liked was that countries that are doing low amounts of testing really only show the tip of the iceberg of contagion in the country. And then countries with more testing like Peru are showing the tip and several feet down. Basically, there's more transparency, and with transparency comes worse looking statistics when it comes to a pandemic. And let me say that Peru is by no means top standards when it comes to testing, nor is Chile. You can see that Italy, the United States even have been testing quite a bit more per million people than Peru and Chile, which means that even in Peru and Chile, you've probably seen the amount of cases being slightly underreported compared to other countries throughout the world, even though it does make things look a little bit better in terms of capabilities versus Mexico, Argentina, and Brazil, as I was saying. However, probably the biggest reason why there are more cases in Peru is because of the country's high informality rate. As you can see on the chart on the left, Peru has the highest informality rates amid large Latin American countries. Incorporating significantly more informal workers into the formal sector must be a priority for Peru's government after this pandemic is over. Based on this, it's not shocking to learn that many Peruvians cannot afford to stay at home during the stay-at-home order. And this has manifested itself in several forms, such as immigrating from Lima to other parts of the country, including famously many thousands of people by foot, taking the virus with them, potentially keeping produce markets open, which are to the two top headlines here, and Peruvians buying from these markets daily because they don't have refrigeration. One of the more other famous statistics from this situation is that only about half of Peruvians have access to refrigerators, which means that in order to eat fresh foods and vegetables, many Peruvians need to go to these markets every day. And you can see that these are some of the headlines that we've seen recently. And the most shocking headline that I saw was the first one about the market in La Victoria, which is the largest fruit market in Lima, in which 80% of the vendors tested positive for COVID-19. So you can only imagine that this is hitting the informal sector and the poor demographics of the population a little bit harder than the rest of the country, because a lot of these people have to go to these fruit markets every day to stock up on food. And it really is a question of, do I eat or not? And that is a situation that is extremely hard to reckon with if you're the government of Peru. So the last primary explanation for the size of the outbreak is strained healthcare infrastructure. Basically, this is a map that shows the occupancy rates of ICU beds based on every department in Peru. And you can see that this was already pretty fragile before COVID-19. The amount of hospital beds per capita in Peru was well below the WHO recommendation, even lower than compared to the rest of the region. Luckily, you can see some of the bigger population centers, such as Lima, not totally strained up until this point. But there are other areas of the country, such as the areas straddling the Amazon in the northeast, as well as Ica and Ayacucho. And then Arequipa, which is also one of the more heavily populated departments in Peru, is also starting to get near its brink. And needless to say, and not trying to be grim here, but if hospitals can't support patients, there's a higher probability that COVID-19 patients don't recover. So that is an incredibly important thing to bear in mind, and it's something that's not just unique to Peru, but other countries in Latin America. But I believe that this is hitting Peru a little bit harder than it is several other countries in the region. So the second factor of our analytical framework for COVID-19 is fiscal capacity. This is one strength that Peru has, and outside of Chile, it's clear that Peru has more favorable fiscal and debt position in the region, which will allow the country to unveil above average size economic stimulus packages, which is already done, but also finance short-term deficits at relatively low cost compared to countries with much worse sovereign credit ratings, such as Colombia, Argentina, and Costa Rica, for example. You can see that Peru's total fiscal stimulus package equates about $26 billion, nearly 12% of GDP. This is pretty massive compared to other stimulus packages we've seen in emerging and frontier markets in general up until this point. So far, most of the stress has been put on a government-backed credit initiative called Reactiva Peru, which is basically an ability for companies of all sizes to get credit lines at favorable rates and under favorable conditions with government backing for easier approval process. The government also announced enhancements to unemployment insurance and granted the bono familiar universal to nearly 75% of Peruvian families. That said, there are a lot of complaints on the ground that this money isn't getting into the hands of the most vulnerable because of the country's low banking penetration. The problem is especially acute for people living outside of urban areas. But I would say even though you've seen the size of this fiscal stimulus package at nearly 12% of GDP, there's probably more room to enhance this even further, considering that there are weaknesses in the current plan and the Peruvian government does have the fiscal capacity to do so and could issue more debt to have a more robust rebound in 2021 and 2022. In the midterm, though, the already announced fiscal stimulus isn't going to be enough to prevent massive job layoffs. You can see in just the rolling quarter of February to April, which didn't even encapsulate the entire quarantine period, you had about 1.169 million people lose their jobs in the greater Lima area, which is nearly a 24% decline from the previous rolling quarter, which is, at least according to these statistics, the worst percentage decline compared to the previous period. Certainly, the numbers are about to get worse. In fact, we even had the numbers from March to May come out yesterday, which suggested that 2.3 million people lost their jobs during that time frame, which is unfortunately about half of the entire labor force in all of Lima, which is probably the worst statistic that I've seen up until this point, and implied an unemployment rate of about 13.4% for just the greater Lima area. Surely the employment decline, I should say, will vary by industry. This slide shows the results of the sensitivity analysis we did comparing the stringency of lockdowns of specific industries versus the size of the labor force. And really the easiest way to look at this is that the industries in the upper right-hand corner of the scatter plot will likely have higher job destruction, greater job destruction, and vice versa. Obviously, these industries are pretty obvious to be hit pretty hard by the pandemic throughout the world. Wholesale and retail, logistics, hotel and restaurants, really anything to do with the leisure industry and education, since everything has been moved online, are definitely things that are going to be hit pretty hard. Whereas some of the more resilient industries will clearly be healthcare, many professional services that allow Peruvians in this case to be working from home, etc. So really the biggest so what of this spike of unemployment and the job losses that we've seen up until this point is going to be wage declines and overall declines in consumption over the medium to long term. You can see that wages already began to decline in April, and they're going to contract even further in May by probably more than 8%. This is going to create a problem with the disposable income in the medium to long term and make a longer recovery for consumer spending over the course of the year. The other thing that's really important about this, and it's going to be something I'm going to explain a little bit later when I talk about our forecasts, is that if you have a high instance of bankruptcies, which is something that we're really expecting globally, not just in Peru, then it's going to create problems where a lot of these jobs that are being lost right now may not be recreated, at least initially, potentially not for a long time. So that means that unemployment is going to be relatively sticky over the coming quarters, and it means that wages are not going to rebound as quickly as we'd like to see them rebound in order to boost consumption. So thirdly, it's important for me to mention that it's not just about the timing of the vaccine, but also the distribution, access to it. And we determine good access in the sense that 50% of critically sick have access to the vaccine. In our base case is that we'll see moderate access to the vaccine in the region by Q4 2021, which influences our economic forecast for that quarter and beyond. We've seen some positive news come out of the vaccine narrative up until this point. We still don't really think that we're going to see a vaccine being fully approved until 2021, probably the first quarter or the second quarter of the year. But that being said, anything earlier obviously would be a good thing for the region, because in our view, the most important thing to restore consumer and business confidence and to start reinvigorating the industries that have been hit really hard by COVID-19, such as tourism, is for people to believe that they're not going to catch the virus if they have the vaccine. And that's something that's really going to take a little bit more time. And for that reason, you could see a slower rebound and recovery out of this crisis than we saw during several other crises in the past, such as the financial crisis or the Asian financial crisis, where several countries in the region did see a much more robust rebound than what we're expecting in 2021 after COVID-19. So the final analytical variable we're leveraging is that COVID-19 will have political and social consequences. I'm going to spend a good 10 minutes in the next section talking about politics in Peru, so I won't get into the nitty-gritty here. But the clear trend across the region is that presidents who prioritize healthcare over the economy enjoyed pretty substantial boosts to their approval ratings. The main ones being Alberto Fernandez of Argentina, Iván Duque of Colombia, and Peru's Martín Vizcarra. And we don't imagine this trend will last forever, because it's not unless there's some sort of really effective conclusion to the health crisis. Also, if the economic situation gets worse, it's hard not to blame your president. But that being said, it has resulted in more trust for the presidents that have reacted a little bit more robustly to the crisis, which could pay dividends for social peace and for political stability after the crisis. But only time will tell with that matter. Putting all of these things that I've said together so far, with the social distancing measures being the x-axis here and the government economic response being the y-axis, this is really kind of the weighted average for the entire region. And you can see that we put flags of different countries throughout this probability table to explain more or less where these countries compare to other countries in the region. You can see that Peru is doing pretty well from the economic lens, at least as far as policy. Obviously, the social distancing measures are going to have an impact on growth this year. But with regards to the healthcare issues that I mentioned earlier, with high levels of informality and unfortunately an accelerating trend of cases and deaths in the country, we do see Peru falling pretty far right on this scale, which means that we do think it's more likely than not that Peru will dance the bachata and deal with the reopening and secondary pockets of the virus slightly less effectively than, say, Colombia and Argentina, which have done a much better job at keeping numbers down and keeping more people healthy. This next page really shows the exact same page that I showed here, but specifically for Peru and specifically the probabilities for Peru. And you can see that the most likely scenario that we see for the country is that it will be in the bachata phase with a strong but insufficient economic stimulus package. Obviously, anything bigger as far as economic stimulus packages is a plus. And if Peru does surprise us and deals with secondary outbreaks extremely effectively, then we could see a more narrow view as far as the more likely scenarios are concerned. And really the key thing that I wanted to mention here is it pertains to our medium to longer term scenarios for Peru and our GDP forecast is really we expect that the GDP economic trajectory entering 2021 will be weak for any square that's in blue, moderate for any square that's in green, and red for any, very weak for any square that's in red, which will definitely play an impact for the internal components of our scenarios that I'll present to you in a few pages.
Thank you, Alex, for that overview of the current COVID-19 crisis in Peru. I'll be honest, Alex, and I think we're probably all thinking this right now, you just presented some pretty distressing figures during that section. Do you have any idea when things will start to get better?
It's a good question. It's something that, I think that has been a struggle for all of us while doing business in the region, is that it's been hitting the region harder than, we would want it to happen. And it's pretty hard to pick apart silver linings of a pretty sad situation throughout the country or throughout the region, not just Peru. But I like to think of myself as an eternal optimist, and I do believe the international community will find some sort of treatment by the end of the year and hopefully a vaccine early next year. And in the case of Peru, I do think things will recover pretty strongly once all the economic activities are back open.
Certainly hope so. So, Alex, can you tell us more about the challenges that Peru is currently facing?
Sure. So as I mentioned earlier, the Peru's economy was trending at a pretty strong pace before the coronavirus outbreak. You can see that we already have official numbers for Q1, which already point to a pretty strong contraction, which means that we're certainly going to see Peru enter its first recession since 1998. And I'm going to present the Q2 numbers later, but you can certainly imagine that Q2 is going to be probably the worst quarter in Peru's history. We're expecting a GDP decline of nearly 30% on a quarter-on-quarter basis in Q2 of 2020, which means that Peru is going to have an extremely deep recession in 2020 and probably the worst one in its history. But before I get too much into our forecast, I do want to start talking a little bit about things that could influence Peru's business and economic outlook from here into the longer term, because not everything is about COVID-19 with the markets that we cover. There are other factors that could come into play that could swing the pendulum one way or the other, so to speak. And the first one is political dynamics. And this really is everything leading up to the 2021 general election and including the 2021 general election. Because as I mentioned earlier, it's pretty easy to forget that Peru does have a lot of very distinct political issues right now and does have elections in 2021. So let's start by describing a little bit of the context here. Last year, President Martin Vizcarra dissolved the former Congress that was elected in 2016, mostly because the party that's in gray here on the outer circle, Fuerza Popular, was pretty obstructive to Martin Vizcarra's anti-corruption agenda, and he was able to use the 2 times vote of no confidence to be able to dissolve Congress and call for snap elections in January 2020, which the Constitutional Court declared as legal. So we had these elections, and in our view, there are 3 main conclusions from it. First, the new Congress is clearly fragmented. There's no one party even close to a majority. This has created some pretty sporadic law proposals from Congress already, even though we largely expected that. The second, and kind of on that same line, however, is that the new Congress, even though it is fragmented, does tend to lean relatively centrist as a whole. There have been a couple makeshift coalitions that have been formed, with Acción Popular leading that coalition, that make the Congress as a whole relatively centrist. And it makes the legislative body slightly more likely to align with the president and his initiatives dealing with anti-corruption and more pro-business economic policy. And then lastly, and probably most importantly, I mentioned Fuerza Popular at the beginning and them being an obstructionary force for the Vizcarra administration's governability. And we think that the mere absence of them, relatively speaking, because they did lose the vast majority of their seats in 2020 compared to what they had in 2016, we think it's to have we think that their dwindled influence on its own will make the Congress more favorable to Peru's outlook than the previous one. Moving forward, we think that the administration's political capital after the pandemic will be key for Vizcarra passing ambitious political agendas or political reforms between now and 2021 when we have general elections. We still think that his high approval rating allows him to dictate the balance of power. In other words, a lot of the agenda items that he wants to get done, if he has a very high approval rating, it's kind of hard for the Congress to continue to obstruct the agenda items that they won campaign for back in 2019, and also ones that they promised to help get done. So that is extremely important. It's also clear, as I mentioned in the last slide, that this new Congress does favor a lot of anti-corruption agenda items that Vizcarra is pushing for. And so far, at least leading till the end of April, you can see that Peruvians were mostly in line with the government's response to COVID-19. But the primary question is whether Vizcarra's extremely high levels of popularity will last. The real economic impacts of the pandemic are starting to be felt. Clear lines of income inequality are getting deeper and wider and becoming more and more obvious, as I mentioned earlier on, with people leaving Peru by foot, for example. And compared to the poll taken in April, as I showed on this slide, support for the nationwide quarantine is starting to fall. And you can see that for the first time since the quarantine began, an economic problem has displaced fear of contagion as the most cited worry by Peruvians, which is not surprising given the fact that many Peruvians, including half in the greater Lima area, have lost their job and their primary source of income. So really because of this, I do think that Vizcarra listens to the polls pretty significantly, as many other presidents obviously do. And the country has decided to speed up its economy a little bit faster than they originally planned to. Basically, the idea was that each phase would happen on a monthly timeline. So they did phase one opening towards the end of May, which would have meant that phase two would have taken place towards the end of this month in June, phase three in July, phase four at the end of August, and by the beginning of September, you'd have close to 100% of the economy online. However, the government did decide to fast forward phase two of the reopening, really kind of in spite of the fact that the amount of cases of COVID-19 in the country had been accelerating. And not only did they accelerate phase two, but they also opened up more industries than they originally aimed to do. Namely, a lot of manufacturing that was slated for phase three has already started to go back online, which means that about 80% of the economy is back online now compared to about 44% during the lockdown, which really was only meant for essential services. Another thing that's really important to notice here is that open pit mining especially was allowed to start during phase one in May, which means that the figures the figures about copper that I'm ready to show in a minute are probably the worst figures that we're going to see during 2020 with regards to the social distancing measures and the sector being mostly on lockdown. And during phase two, they allowed all mining to reopen, not just open pit mining, which means that we're probably going to see even stronger recovery of the mining sector during June, July, and August that we did see during especially March and April of this year. So really, all of this is going to play an impact on the elections in 2021. Obviously, it's a little too early to tell what will happen during these elections next year. But one thing that we can say is that there's still a high level of political malaise. And that was something that was definitely a feature last year. It was something that was a feature during the elections this year, where you had a really you had a really low level of turnout. And that could be something that could create more risk for 2021 if there is low levels of turnout. And if you see this vast majority of the people who answered none of the above in this poll decide to spoil their ballots or not vote. Obviously, it increases the risk of the election as it would anywhere. But that being said, we still think policy continuity, at least from the executive branch, is most likely to last. Our expectation is that Vizcarra, who has said explicitly that he will not run for re-election, will likely endorse a presidential candidate. And assuming that Vizcarra is still popular, that candidate has a great chance of winning in our view. And if I were to make a call right now, I do believe that Salvador del Solar has the best chance of winning on this list due to his association with Vizcarra as his former prime minister. But a lot could change in 1 year. You can still see George Forsyth has about 25% of the opinion poll voting intentions from this poll in May. And we'll probably see this evolve pretty significantly as time goes along. So the second factor that is very important to monitor is mineral prices. And specifically, the price of copper is obviously one of the most important sources of revenue for Peru. The vast majority of Peru's exports are mining exports, with about 40 to 50% of them being copper. You can see that copper prices have started to increase pretty substantially and have even entered a bull market based on the technical definition of it. But that being said, you can see the exports have plummeted, which can only be explained by the fact that production has fallen, which makes sense given the fact that open pit mines, for the most part, were not allowed to operate during the months of March and April, which means that we should probably see these figures start to recover starting in later in May and June, especially now that we're seeing that copper prices are close to back to the end of 2019 levels. But that being said, we're not really expecting any sort of economic miracle from the export sector in Peru. You can see that these are forecasts from more developed markets and obviously some of the major export destinations for Peru. And you can see that we're expecting China to only grow by 1.3%, and most of the rest of the developed markets, including the United States and Western Europe, to enter a pretty deep recession this year. And something that you'll see is that the rebound in 2021 is certainly nice to see in terms of percentage change. But as you'll expect, this is not nearly the same level that these countries were at in 2019, meaning that commodity prices will probably not get back to the same level as they were back in 2018 and 2019. In other words, they probably have a ceiling. So really, if we put all these factors together, you can see our scenarios here, with the x-axis being some of the internal factors I mentioned, such as the political environment and structural damage from COVID-19, and the potential social unrest that could occur after COVID-19, which is something that I'll mention when we talk a little bit more detailed about these scenarios. And then the y-axis, we have external factors such as global market sentiment and copper prices. You can see that our base case is that Peru will recover to its 2019 levels in 2023. This is going to result in challenging internal conditions and an external U-shaped recovery from China, the United States, et cetera. Obviously, anything that is a bigger bump from the external side would result in higher growth in 2021 and probably 2020 for that matter, but that's not our expectation. And instead of that, a positive outcome is that you have Vizcarra still maintain its popularity. You have someone who's pro-market win the election and form a coalition. And this is a situation that could result in the 2022 recovery versus 2023. So I'm going to stop here and ask a quick question about things that I've mentioned up until this point, including some factors I haven't explicitly mentioned. But what do you think is the biggest risk in Peru as it pertains to your business through 2021? So we're seeing a few answers come in. I'm probably not going to spend too much time on this slide just because we are with only about 15 minutes left. But I am interested to see that we are seeing low business and consumer confidence getting a pretty high amount. The 2021 elections are certainly important. But one thing that I was thinking while creating this presentation is you've had political risk in Peru for nearly 3 decades, but still pretty strong economic performance. So I think that the thing that's pretty unique to at least the post-COVID-19 world is when we're going to see businesses and consumer confidence pick up. And I think the other thing I would mention here that I would think about personally is that if Peru does end up spending the entire bank, so to speak, this year and next, you're certainly going to have higher risk of higher taxation through the medium to longer term. So I'm going to continue on here and talk a little bit more about some of the numbers that obviously matter to you and your business, and probably the biggest question mark that you've had up until this point. And you can see here that we are expecting Peru to enter a very deep recession this year. We foresee a decline of 10.3%, which does take into account the catastrophic 40% decline in activity that we saw in April that we learned about yesterday. Obviously, this is going to be one of the worst declines in the region and probably the worst recession in Peru's history since the war with Chile, towards the beginning of last century. But you can see that Peru, we are expecting to rebound pretty robustly in 2021 before entering a new normal 2.3% in 2020 and 3.4% in 2023. However, even though that number of 8.3% looks impressive, you can see, at least when we're comparing it to activity in 2019, and even compared to where we were forecasting Peru back in January when we did not know much about COVID-19, and if it even comes to the region, you can see that we're not expecting economic activity to make up for this year until 2023. Why is that the case? It's a lot of what I was mentioning earlier on, where we have high risk of bankruptcies in 2020, leading to overall lower investment. This is probably going to result in a slow employment recovery, lower confidence levels because people aren't going to have the same levels of discretionary income that they had earlier. You're going to start entering the question of fiscally constrained governments over the medium to long term, and the external equation is probably going to be U-shaped and not V-shaped. You can see here, this is where we see quarterly forecasts going towards the end of 2021. Again, as long as we have any sort of normalcy in economic activity, we should see Q3 be a pretty significant recovery, at least on a quarter-on-quarter basis compared to Q2. But we're not going to get anywhere close to where we were in Q4 2019, even throughout the entirety of next year. In fact, you can see on a quarter-on-quarter basis, we're expecting more or less flat growth once we get into 2021, and the initial boost from getting most economic activities back operational is no longer beneficial to the statistics. So that's just our personal opinion that we'll probably see some sort of bump in Q3, but not a more significant recovery until later on. But I am curious on how this impacts your business, and would you expect sales to pick up in Peru? Okay, starting to get some answers in. Maybe give this another 5 to 10 more seconds. One thing that I've noticed is that, again, compared to the first question that we asked back in, when we had one of these webinars for the first time at the end of March and the beginning of April, I think that these answers have become more pessimistic as time goes along, with more people saying closer to Q4 or not even until 2021. I am interested to see that there are some people who are seeing some rebound now, and there are some people who are not even expecting sales to fall in the coming months and quarters. So that's great for them. But we are seeing close to 50% of our clients saying not until 2021 here. So that is interesting for sure. So really, just to kind of sum up the forecasts and scenarios portion of the presentation, I do want to present you the kind of the total summary package of the scenarios that I've mentioned up until this point. This does take into consideration the probability table that I showed a few slides ago, which basically shows that we are expecting Peru to recover in 2023 with the figures that you see here. You can also see the average FX forecast that we're expecting for Peru through 2023 in all three scenarios. And just to kind of give a little bit of color here, you can see that in the base case, we are expecting a less effective containment, strong but insufficient economic stimulus, U-shaped recovery in the US, China, and Europe. And as far as some of the domestic factors are concerned, we see some of the political agenda approved. I think that there's probably more potential for Vizcarra's political reforms to get approved than, say, the pension reform that he tried to announce a few weeks ago and would like to get done by the end of the year. I think that's a little bit more contentious and probably something that is going to be too much against the clock to get done during the Vizcarra administration. Obviously, if you do see it done, and if you see most or all of the political reforms get done, that's really great for investor confidence, and you could see more of a nod towards an upside scenario and a really strong recovery in 2021. The general elections, again, I think I mentioned this, but we expect a pro-market presidential candidate to win, but will likely need to deal with a fragmented Congress, so very similar to what Vizcarra is dealing with now. And you could see some mild, really regionally focused protests emerge after the pandemic ends, because it's very clear that a pretty big portion of the population didn't really have total access to the government's relief measures, and a lot of them had to move and leave their homes. I think it's something to be considering. I don't think we're going to see the same size of protests that we saw in Chile towards the end of 2019, nor do we even expect the kind of protests that we saw in Colombia as our base case, even though that is something that we've seen our downside. But I think it is something that you should bear in mind, that you could see slight operational disruptions in maybe some of the poorer neighborhoods of Lima and in some regionally focused areas that could impact your logistics functions. But I don't think that we should expect anything major, at least while Vizcarra maintains its popularity. So here I'm going to transition quickly into what we should expect for your business, some actions to take before I open up the floor for questions and answers. We only have a few slides here to go through, and this is the first one. Obviously, there's a lot of information here. Going column by column here, you can see there are things that are companies that are doing right now in these four buckets of people, CSR, business, process, and planning to adapt to an unprecedented situation. But at the same time, companies can't afford to not think about the recovery phase. And here, the most important question we are getting is when demand will recover in the markets that we cover, which is something that I mentioned a few slides ago. And I know all companies are doing this, and I hope that we could shed some light on this. But something that a lot of companies aren't doing right now is thinking about the post-pandemic new normal, which is what we have on the right side column here. So here we're talking about these long-term implications. And really, I would recommend that you do spend some time on this and not spend so much time on firefighting, such as rethinking work culture and what that means, reprofiling talent to one of the post-pandemic new normal. This is really important for digital transformation as well. If you can try to get some digital talent now, it would be a really great investment. And as far as your business goes, anticipating how the market will change after recovery, so doing more rounds of customer segmentation and product segmentation in that matter. But if we are going back to the short term really quickly, and out of the things that I had on the first column from this page, you can see that protecting cash here is probably the most important thing, and the thing that we're hearing the most about from what clients are doing. And then and you can see from a P&L perspective, bringing cash in by using new sales channels or reducing your prices and incentivize sales is one thing that people are doing. A lot of our B2C clients, when they can, are pushing products e-commerce. In fact, a lot of clients have really only seen e-commerce as the only channel during this time. As far as costs go in the P&L, OPEX cuts for personnel are non-essential costs. You've seen, at least financially speaking, long-term loans be refinanced. You might want to restructure these now on the back of more favorable interest rates and credit terms. Obviously, CapEx is something where a lot of big investments have just been frozen. This has been almost universal. And then working capital, obviously, this is kind of the more complicated of all the things on this list here, because it's great if you could reduce days of sales outstanding if possible, and prolong days payable with your channel partners or your suppliers, but that's easier said than done. The other thing that we have seen some clients have a little bit more ease with is clearing inventory with hard discounts. This is, interestingly enough, something that I've seen in DC and in New York in the United States. A lot of restaurants have just been selling their liquor stash at really cheap deals to just pay the bills and to keep the restaurant up and running. I'm not saying that that's something that you should do as well with dealing with your inventory, but clearing it with hard discounts and trying to keep the revenue figures up is something that could protect the bottom line and protect cash during the COVID-19 crisis. So this is the second to last polling question I'll ask. So out of everything that I've said, where is your company concentrated the most as it pertains to protecting cash? And you can see that we go anywhere from we don't foresee any cash problems to dealing with the top line, or when it comes to costs, reducing and containing OPEX, reducing or containing APEX. And then we even have as option I, we're doing all of the above as much as we can. Great. When we've been asking this question in the past, we've certainly seen at least a plurality of clients saying that they're reducing or containing OPEX as much as possible. Obviously, it's great to do as much of these as you can, but maybe you have strengths in some areas of the P&L that other companies don't. So this is great, and I think I'll move on from here because we do have one more polling, and I do want to give at least 5 minutes for the Q&A portion. So the second to last slide here is, diamonds still exist in the rough. There's still opportunities in Peru. I think there's something to be said about the fact that Peru has had such a long record of macro prudency and really clear rules of the game. That's something that I think is really only shared with Chile as far as the rest of the region is concerned, is with big markets. But there are also other things you can be doing right now. The economic environment does invite low valuations. And if you are someone who's more risk-taking in this environment, it could open opportunities to expand inorganically in Peru vis-a-vis M&A. Obviously, everyone's trying to accelerate digital transformation now. keep doing it. It's something I think that is going to prove to pay dividends in Peru, especially in Peru when the entire e-commerce and digital customer engagement market is a little bit less developed than other countries in the region. We're going to see that start to change pretty quickly. Supply chain, for a lot of people, this is a good time to push for localization. Value proposition, trying to adapt value proposition to new customer behaviors, where to play and how to win. Obviously, entering new departments in Peru would be something that could be beneficial. Also, another thing that we've heard a lot of clients do is forging non-traditional partnership to expand market access. So this could be, partnering with a product to help influence working from home, or a lot of liquor companies in Latin America have been partnering with Rappi and other delivery services to try to advance that go-to-market strategy where applicable. Obviously, this isn't legal in every country in the region, but that's something to keep in mind. And then organizational footprint, just rethinking office space, because we're going to be entering a new normal in which we're not going to have a vaccine immediately. And a lot of people have potentially gotten really comfortable with this idea of working from home or working remotely. So you may have to ask yourself, is it really worth to be paying as much as you're paying potentially on commercial leases or even commercial real estate have you owned? So this is the last question here. I'm just curious on where you do see the biggest business opportunity for your company in Peru, at least out of the things that I've mentioned on the previous slide. Potentially you have another option here, and these are obviously really high level items, but it would be great if we did know, got an idea of where you are thinking about playing next in Peru. So Madison, I think while we're getting some of these answers in, if you do have any questions that you've gotten over the line through the Ducker Frontier webinars, and again, you can submit a question through the chat function on Ducker Frontier's webinars directly. This could be a good opportunity for me to go ahead and start answering some questions.
Fantastic, Alex. Yes, we have already gotten a few questions come in. The first one we would like to ask is, do you see any industry returning to growth faster than the rest? Or in other words, what are the opportunities in Peru?
That's a great question. It's one that we get all the time. We just had a relatively negative presentation, at least as far as like numbers with the economy and what have you. Obviously, there are opportunities when it comes to industries. I think the first one that's going to be kind of obvious is mining. Once we have all the mines operating and you start having exports pick up to China, and to have miners actually take advantage of slightly higher prices, that's going to start bringing in some revenues to that industry. But I think another one that maybe people don't think about too specifically right now, just because it's been being hit extremely hard by COVID-19, is construction. And the reason why I say that is because the Peruvian government's going to spend a ton of money on public investments and public infrastructure once this is done, which means that a lot of the people who have been working in the construction industry who have lost their job could potentially recover that job quite a bit quicker than other industries such as retail. And really on that note, I do think that you're going to be looking at potentially a 12-month recovery for discretionary retail in Peru, really throughout the world, just as while people have low consumer confidence and low wages when it comes to unemployment. So there's two opportunities, and I guess one maybe challenge industry for you.
Thank you, Alex. And for those of you still in the line, we'd be happy to stay a few more minutes to answer some more questions. So please keep submitting if you'd like. The next question that we have is, a recession would likely diminish presidential popularity and might create social unrest. Since elections are scheduled for next year, is there a chance we'll see a radical political option getting elected?
Another really good question. And, I think with regards to Peru, they've gotten, let's just say, a little bit fortunate with the fact that Vizcarra is their president. He's been extremely popular really ever since he came into office. But to the question's point, if you do have a really strong recession and, these, 2.5 million people who have lost their jobs, if you don't have nearly half of them, for example, get those jobs back anytime soon, you are going to start having people point their fingers to the government. And that is going to have an impact on Vizcarra. That being said, we do have a history in Peru where you do have quite a long track record of pro-market presidents being elected. Even you had President Humala, who came into the office thinking that we would think he was more center-left, who ended up being pretty market-friendly himself. So those kind of institutions and that legacy in Peru are there. But given the fact that Vizcarra doesn't even have his own political party, you could see a situation in which an anti-establishment candidate does get quite a bit of traction, especially in a society in which not a lot of people identify with a political party and not a lot of people have a clear voting intention. So you could see a more anti-establishment candidate gain popularity. But my thought would be that if you have someone like that gain popularity, it would probably be someone more on the center right or the right than you would have someone on the center left or the left. And I do think that overall, with Peru having the track record that it does, that you do have a greater potential of having a pro-business candidate win. But obviously, it could go the other way. And if you do have a stronger recession than expected, you could have an anti-establishment candidate win in 2021, which is something that we explicitly say for our downside scenario for Peru.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And here's a great one that just came in. Forecasts might be modified over time as the containment and as the crisis evolves. How often will we be updating our forecasts, and how can we get access to those in the future?
That's a really good question. To be honest, I modified Peru's forecast yesterday in response to the 40% decline that we saw in April, because I was assuming that the decline would be closer to 30%. So we do typically run our forecast cycles formally once per month, and these forecasts are published on our Frontier View platform a few days after we update them in the system. We are doing our next forecasting round this week, and the new forecast should be on the platform in the next 10 or so days. But we do typically do them once per month. That being said, if there is like a shocking economic statistic that comes out, or there is some sort of really extraordinary event that occurs, which has happened a few times during COVID-19, we will occasionally forecast off cycle. But that being said, to answer the question quickly, we do it once per month, and you can get access to them on Frontier View. And if you're not currently a client, I do encourage you to reach out to Madison or even myself later on after the presentation so that we can help.
All right. We do have a few more questions. I know we are running a few minutes over time. But here's another one for us. You said that the government could do more to help the economy. What specific policies or actions would you recommend, especially as we're moving into the dance phase?
So there have been a few things that Peru has not done that other countries have done. One of the things that comes to mind really quickly is some sort of moratorium on mortgages or rent, which is something that you've seen, at least rents, you saw that happen in New York. You've seen the moratorium on mortgages happen in Argentina. I think that's something that the government could consider. I think that in general, it would be nice to see a little bit more direct benefits to companies and to individuals that are not just based on getting easy access to credit, which is what I think the majority of the government program has been so far through the Reactiva Peru initiative. So it could be more tax relief for businesses and individuals. I definitely think that there needs to be another round of the bonus that Vizcarra paid out. In fact, I think it'd be a very strong consideration just to go ahead and do maybe another month or two of UBI, Universal Basic Income. That would definitely, mitigate the storm a little bit better for Peruvian consumers in the medium to long term. Those are just some ideas. Obviously, they come with a price tag, but as I was saying earlier, Peru's debt situation is extremely favorable. It's only about 30% of GDP. They could always issue more debt, as they did a few months ago or a few weeks ago. So there are more options. So we'll see what happens, but the government seems pretty open to doing more economic stimulus packages, potentially after the pandemic is over, to try to steer the economy back on track once the virus is gone.
Great, Alex. Well, thank you so much for answering some of these questions. Do you have any final remarks before we conclude today's webinar?
No, not really. Thank you all for attending. And again, I want to send my sincere wishes about all of you and your family doing well. And we look forward to having you on future webinars.
Thank you so much. And if anyone posed a question that we were unable to answer today, please do reach out to your client relationship manager, and we'll definitely try to answer your question via email. We can always set up further conversations as need be. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, everyone.